So imagine you're building a program which is used to store all the names of all the students in the school. Now it's simple if you're just doing a single class. At most you're going to have 30 names. And you're going to have 30 variables to do that. You want to display them all, you just display them all one at a time. No problem. Now, but if you're doing it for the whole school, all of a sudden that number goes from 30 to 1300. So your code just exponentially grew, well, not exponentially, but blew up in terms of its size and in terms of the storage requirements. The storage requirements, we can't really do that, and we can't really change much about that. But what we can do is we can reduce the amount of code in order to actually handle something like this. You know you don't want to create 1,300 variables just for different names. That's just ridiculous and not very useful. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn a technique today to group variables into what we call a collection. That collection in JavaScript is essentially what's called an array. An array is just a sequential set of memory. So if we look at our memory, it's just a sequential set of memory where each little spot has another entry. Now in our case, it might be 1,300 strings, 1,300 pieces of text, 1,300 names. Now normally when we think of a variable, we think of it like a bucket. That bucket has a name, so it might be something like name. No problem. And if we had a whole bunch of those for each student, we might have like name 1, then we have another one, name 2, another one, name 3, and so on and so forth. So we might have 30 of these buckets for a class. Now, I want to be able to do something where I can utilize all of these elements under a single name, and that's where an array comes in play. So what it's going to do is instead of having 30 individual buckets, it's going to have one big bucket that is segmented. And each spot is essentially a blank bucket for another entry. So I might have like Bob here, and then Steve here, and Jane here, and so on and so forth. So we have all these different names, and each one gets its own slot. Now, what's the point? Well, the point is I can group these things under a single name. Maybe this one is just called names. Now, of course, it's pluralized because I'm not talking about an individual name anymore. I'm talking about a collection of names. So we want to pluralize that name to emphasize that fact. So this entity here is called an array. Each one of the entries inside of the array is called an element. So this is typically how we'll visualize it. We'll visualize it as just like a big grouping of individual elements. Now, if we were doing something more simplified, let's say an array of numbers, let's say we have an array of numbers that looks something like this. You might have like 9, 6, -3, 7, 5, and 2. And I might ask you a question like, what is the value of the third element? And you would tell me, oh, that's -3. No problem. Now, when we're talking about this, it's easy enough to think of individual variables. So if you want to display an individual variable, it's simple just to refer to it by its name. So you could do a console.log name1. No problem. That would work just fine. But what if I wanted to display one of the names inside of the names array? That's a bit of a difference. I can't just say I can't do something like this. Console.log names. It doesn't work. Whereas console.log name1 works just fine. The problem lies in the fact of ambiguity. The language doesn't know what we're talking about, which name within the names array. That's important. So what we do is we have to understand that the way that these arrays are constructed is that each one has its kind of like its own little address. Think of it like ordering a pizza. And if you order a pizza, if this is my street that I live on, and this street is called names, each house in the street has a number. And that number is where I actually live, or whoever lives. So we number them from left to right, starting at 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So these Names are numbered from 0 through 8. So what would happen over here is instead of just saying console.log names, I would actually have to specify, well, which one specifically do I want to display? So if I wanted to display Steve, I would have to display the address 1, and I show that it's an address by surrounding it in square brackets. Just put my semicolon here. We have each of these addresses has a special name inside of programming. It's called an index. It's just a fancy way of saying an address. So when I order a pizza, I would say, bring it to, oops, where did that go? We might say something like, bring it to Autumn Hill Boulevard, number 555. And that, of course, is the address of the school. But in your place, you would give your actual address, the street, followed by the number. We would do the exact same thing in our program. The name of the array, followed by the index. You gotta be careful, though, because notice that the index values start at 0. So if I were to ask you, well, how many elements are in that names array, you would tell me there are 9 elements, 1 through 8, and the 0 element. So that's 9 actual elements. Down here in this array, over here, let's call this the nums array. And we would number these 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I ask you how many elements are in this array, you would say 6 elements. Now let's try a little bit of other terminology. If I say, what is the value at the second element? The second element, well, this is the second element, so you would tell me its value is 6. But if I say, what is the value at index 4? Well, that's not the 4th element. I said at index 4. That's this one down here. So that would give me a value of 5. So you got to be very careful with the terminology that's used and how people reference things. So whenever we want to access these things, as I said, we just use the square brackets to say, hey, we're specifying an address into an array, and please locate that exact one. This allows us to group all of this data into a single entity known as these arrays with these names that go by a single name. It makes our lives a lot easier. So when we're going to display something like all the names of the students in the school, we can just go through and say, give me names 0, now give me names 1, now give me names 2. When we say that, we say names at 0, names at 1, names at 2. So it's saying the names array at index 2, names at 3, names at 4, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the very end. And that is essentially what an array is.